March 10, 1945. Tokyo before dawn. The city lies beneath a low winter haze, a thin gray veil drifting between wooden rooftops and narrow streets. Paper walls breathe in the cold air. Somewhere, a distant train groans along steel rails, carrying workers toward factories that have already been marked on enemy maps. The capital of the Japanese Empire is awake, but uneasy, living in the quiet tension of a nation that senses the war has turned against it, yet still believes the homeland itself remains protected. Above the city, far beyond human sight, the sky is no longer empty. At first there is only vibration, a faint tremor moving through the thin upper air. Not thunder. Not wind. A steady, mechanical resonance, smooth and unhurried. Then comes the sound itself, low and constant, multiplied dozens of times over, rolling across the stratosphere like an approaching tide. Silver aircraft glide through the darkness, wings catching faint reflections of moonlight. Their fuselages are long and elegant, their movement confident, almost casual. These machines are not searching. They are not lost. They are exactly where they intend to be. They should not exist here. For years, Japanese military doctrine had rested on a simple, comforting truth. Single-engine enemy fighters could never reach Tokyo. Distance itself was a weapon. The Pacific Ocean, stretching thousands of miles, had always served as a natural moat around the empire. Even as American bombers began striking the home islands, they arrived alone, unsupported, exposed, and vulnerable to interception. That belief had shaped strategy, training, and morale. And now, at this very moment, it is being erased. The aircraft crossing the skies above Tokyo are American P-51D Mustangs, flying from the newly captured island of Iwo Jima, nearly 750 miles away. They are not gasping for fuel. They are not turning back. They are escorting bombers, patrolling airspace, and hunting enemy fighters over the heart of Japan itself. This is the moment Japanese pilots were never trained to face. The moment Japanese commanders insisted was impossible. The moment when geography, faith, and tradition collapse under the weight of engineering. The contradiction at the heart of this story defines the final phase of the Pacific War. Japan believed that spirit, discipline, and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. The United States believed that technology, logistics, and industrial scale could extend power across any distance on Earth. Both sides were willing to die for those beliefs. Only one could survive them. By early 1945, the Pacific War had already consumed millions of lives. The once feared Imperial Japanese Navy lay shattered on the ocean floor. Veteran pilots, men trained before the war, hardened in China and the opening months of the conflict, had been lost in battles Japan could not replace. Fuel shortages crippled training. Factories were bombed, dispersed, and starved of resources. Aircraft were built faster than pilots could be taught to fly them. Yet one conviction remained unbroken: the skies over Tokyo would be defended. Tokyo was more than a city. It was the seat of the emperor, the spiritual center of the nation, the symbol of Japan's destiny. To imagine enemy fighters roaming freely above it was not simply a military failure, it was a cultural and psychological catastrophe. Across the Pacific, American planners thought in colder terms. By 1944, the United States was no longer reacting to events. It was calculating them. War had become a problem of distance, fuel, production, and time. Every obstacle could be measured. Every weakness could be exploited. The only question was whether American industry could move fast enough to turn theory into reality. The solution to Japan's final defense was not a larger bomber. It was a fighter with unprecedented reach. The P-51 Mustang did not begin the war as a legend. Early versions were fast but flawed, limited at high altitude. Everything changed when British engineers fitted the airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, producing nearly 1,700 horsepower. The transformation was dramatic. The Mustang gained speed, altitude, reliability, and, most importantly, range. With external fuel tanks, the P-51 could fly 1,500 miles, fight, and return. For the first time in aviation history, single-engine fighters were no longer bound by coastlines. Distance stopped being protection. When American forces captured Iwo Jima in February 1945, after a brutal 5-week battle that killed nearly 7,000 Marines, the island's value was immediately understood. It was not just a place to land damaged bombers. It was a launch point. A forward platform from which fighters could reach the Japanese homeland. Runways were carved from volcanic ash while gunfire still echoed in the hills. Fuel dumps rose beside wreckage. Within weeks, Mustangs were arriving, refueling, and preparing for missions that would permanently alter the balance of air power. Japanese radar operators were the first to sense the change. Reports came in describing American fighters arriving with the bombers and staying. They did not peel away. They did not retreat. They remained overhead, controlling altitude, waiting. Commanders questioned the reports. Pilots were confused. Doctrine offered no explanation. Then came the first sightings over Tokyo itself. The sky, once sacred and distant, was suddenly occupied by enemy machines that moved with confidence and precision. Japanese pilots scrambled upward, only to discover the Americans were already above them, holding the sun, choosing when to strike. This was not merely a tactical shock. It was a psychological rupture. The belief that had sustained Japan through years of hardship, that the homeland was unreachable, collapsed in real time. And with it fell the final illusion that the war could be contained, endured, or outlasted. The appearance of the P-51 Mustang over Tokyo was not the end of the war. But it marked the moment when the outcome became unavoidable. From that day forward, Japanese airspace was no longer defensible. The sky itself had changed hands. This story is not only about aircraft and battles. It is about the death of assumptions. About how modern war rewards preparation over passion, logistics over legend, and systems over sacrifice. It is about the moment when belief meets evidence, and loses. When American P-51 Mustangs shocked Japan over Tokyo, they did more than escort bombers. They revealed a truth that would define the modern world. The future belongs to those who can master distance, technology, and time itself. Before the P-51 Mustang appeared over Tokyo, Japan's air defense system rested on assumptions forged during earlier phases of the war. In 1941 and 1942, Japanese fighters had dominated the skies with agility, range, and experienced pilots. Victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific reinforced a belief that skill and spirit could compensate for industrial limits. By the time the war turned against Japan, that belief had hardened into doctrine. Japanese air planners expected bombers, not fighters, to threaten the homeland. Interception tactics focused on climbing rapidly, making a single decisive attack and returning to base. Fighters were designed for short-range defense, not prolonged engagement. Fuel conservation shaped every mission. The sky over Tokyo was imagined as a final sanctuary, protected not only by guns and pilots but by the vast distances of the Pacific itself. Yet distance had already begun to betray Japan. American industry expanded at a scale no nation had ever matched. Factories operated around the clock, turning raw materials into aircraft, engines, radios, and weapons with ruthless efficiency. Training programs produced pilots with hundreds of flight hours, drilled in formation flying, gunnery, navigation, and radio discipline. Every loss could be replaced. Every lesson could be incorporated. Japan could not match this rhythm. Fuel shortages forced pilot training hours down to a fraction of pre-war levels. Veteran aviators were sent into combat repeatedly, their experience spent like currency until nothing remained. New pilots arrived at the front with minimal preparation, brave but unready. Aircraft production continued, but quality suffered as factories were dispersed, materials grew scarce, and skilled labor disappeared into the draft. The Ki-84 Hayate emerged from this strain as Japan's final hope. On paper, it was formidable, fast, heavily armed, capable of climbing quickly and matching the Mustang at certain altitudes. In reality, its engines suffered from poor metallurgy and low-grade fuel. Landing gear collapsed. Weapons jammed. Many aircraft never left the ground. Those that did often failed at the moment they were most needed. American planners understood these weaknesses, but they also understood something more important. Air superiority was not achieved by winning individual dogfights. It was achieved by controlling time, altitude, and replacement. To do that, fighters had to be present not just at the battle but before it, during it, and after it. That requirement made range the decisive factor. The P-51 Mustang was built around that idea. With its Merlin engine, laminar flow wing, and external fuel tanks, it could escort bombers deeper than any fighter before it. It could loiter. It could hunt. It could choose when to engage and when to withdraw. Over Europe, it had already proven its value by breaking the Luftwaffe's back. Over the Pacific, its impact would be even more profound. The capture of Iwo Jima transformed theory into reality. Situated roughly midway between the Marianas and Japan, the island offered runways close enough to escort bombers all the way to Tokyo. Engineers worked under fire, leveling volcanic ash into airstrips while wounded Marines were still being evacuated. Within weeks, Mustangs were operating from the island, extending American reach into what had once been Japan's inner air defense zone. The first escort missions were cautious. Pilots monitored fuel carefully, calculating every mile. Navigation errors could mean death by ditching in the Pacific. But the results were immediate. For the first time, B-29 bombers arrived over Japan with fighters above them, around them, and ahead of them. Japanese radar stations detected the change, but comprehension lagged behind observation. Reports described fighters staying with the bombers, circling, climbing, and diving at will. Interceptors scrambled only to find themselves outmaneuvered before contact was even made. American fighters were already at altitude, already positioned, already prepared. The turning point came when Mustangs stopped merely escorting and began sweeping. Instead of waiting for Japanese fighters to rise, they attacked airfields directly, destroying aircraft on the ground, strafing fuel dumps, and forcing Japan's limited air force to react defensively. This reversed the psychological dynamic of air combat. Japanese pilots no longer felt they were defending home skies. They felt hunted within them. Over Tokyo, the effect was devastating. Japanese pilots climbing to intercept found Mustangs descending from above, using speed and altitude as weapons. American formations maintained discipline, communicating by radio, covering one another's blind spots. Attacks were coordinated, brief, and lethal. There was no circling duel, no test of individual bravery. There was only execution. One Japanese pilot later recalled climbing until his engine began to fail, only to see enemy fighters still higher, silhouettes against the sun. Another described firing once before his guns jammed, watching helplessly as Mustangs passed through his formation and vanished into the clouds. American pilots described a different experience. Many expressed disbelief at how little resistance they faced once Japanese aircraft were airborne. Jerry Yellin, flying with the 78th Fighter Squadron, remembered seeing enemy fighters break apart under coordinated attacks, unable to regroup. James Tapp recalled that the greatest danger was not combat, but fuel miscalculation on the long return to Iwo Jima. Radio chatter reflected the imbalance. American transmissions were calm, procedural, professional. Japanese communications were fragmented, urgent, often cut short. The difference was not courage. It was system. The human cost on both sides was severe. Japanese pilots fought knowing their chances were slim. Many took off in aircraft they did not trust, fueled by supplies they knew were inadequate. They rose anyway, driven by duty and by the understanding that failure meant the enemy would roam freely above their families and their capital. American pilots, too, bore psychological weight. They understood that dominance did not eliminate danger. Mechanical failure over open ocean was often fatal. Combat still demanded focus and restraint. Yet they flew with confidence in their machines, their training, and the support system behind them. The consequences of these encounters were measurable and relentless. American kill ratios over Japan reached as high as 13-1. Airfields were rendered unusable. Replacement aircraft could not be fueled. Training programs collapsed entirely. By mid-1945, Japan's air defense network existed largely on paper. Production numbers told the larger story. The United States built 15,586 P-51 Mustangs. Japan produced 3,514 Ki-84s, many of which never saw combat. Every loss widened a gap that could not be closed. Psychologically, the effect was catastrophic for Japan. The presence of American fighters over Tokyo shattered the belief that the homeland was protected. Civilians saw contrails overhead without hearing anti-aircraft fire. Pilots reported enemy aircraft lingering with impunity. The sky, once a symbol of national strength, became a reminder of vulnerability. This transformation marked the end of an era. Air combat was no longer a contest of individual skill alone. It was an extension of industrial capacity, logistical planning, and technological integration. The P-51 Mustang did not merely defeat Japanese fighters. It rendered Japan's entire defensive concept obsolete. By the time the war entered its final months, the outcome in the air was no longer in doubt. Japan could still fight on land and sea, but without control of the sky, every movement was exposed, every supply line threatened, every city vulnerable. The Mustangs continued to fly, day after day, escorting bombers, sweeping airfields, and enforcing a new reality above Japan. Their presence signaled not just military dominance, but the arrival of a new form of warfare, one in which belief could not substitute for production, and tradition could not outfly technology. The sky over Tokyo had been taken, not by a single battle, but by a system that Japan could neither match nor escape. The transformation was complete. The confrontation was decided. And the consequences would echo far beyond the war itself. When the engines faded and the contrails dissolved, the silence over Tokyo felt heavier than the roar that had preceded it. The sky, once filled with movement, now seemed vast and indifferent, as though it had already accepted its new owner. For the people below, that silence carried a message more powerful than any explosion. The war had reached a point from which there was no return. Japan continued to fight, but it fought beneath a sky it could no longer control. The appearance of American P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo did not immediately end the war, yet it marked the moment when the final illusion collapsed. The homeland was no longer distant. The emperor's city was no longer shielded. The air, once sacred and fiercely defended, had become an open corridor for enemy power. In military terms, the meaning was clear. Air superiority had shifted decisively and permanently. Japanese commanders could no longer plan operations assuming the sky would provide protection. Every movement, every factory, every rail line now existed under the constant threat of observation and attack. The defensive perimeter that had once stretched across the Pacific had folded inward, leaving the core exposed. But the deeper impact was psychological. For years, Japanese society had endured hardship through belief. The belief that sacrifice had purpose. That endurance would be rewarded. That the homeland itself was inviolable. The Mustangs over Tokyo shattered that belief with cold efficiency. They did not announce themselves with dramatic battles or heroic charges. They simply arrived, stayed, and returned again and again. The sky told the truth before any official statement could. Pilots who survived the encounters carried that knowledge home. Some spoke of it openly, others remained silent. Many simply understood that the war was no longer a test of will, but of inevitability. Courage had not failed them. The system that sustained courage had. For American airmen, the victory brought no celebration in the moment. Missions continued. Losses still occurred. Mechanical failure over the Pacific remained unforgiving. Yet there was an unspoken recognition that the air war had been decided. The discipline of escort, sweep, and return had worked exactly as designed. The theory had become reality. The P-51 Mustang itself became a symbol not of destruction, but of reach. It represented a shift in how power was applied, less dependent on proximity, more dependent on preparation. It was not the fastest aircraft, nor the most heavily armed, but it was the most balanced. It embodied a philosophy of warfare built on endurance, coordination, and adaptability. After the war, that philosophy did not disappear. Japan emerged from defeat transformed. The same society that had once invested its faith in spiritual endurance redirected its energy toward rebuilding. Factories replaced airfields as symbols of national strength. Precision, efficiency, and quality became new forms of discipline. The lesson was absorbed quietly without spectacle. Survival in the modern world required mastery of systems, not defiance of them. The United States, victorious, faced its own reckoning. Industrial superiority had won the war, but at an immense human cost. Cities lay in ruins. Civilian casualties numbered in the millions. The power to project force across oceans brought with it moral responsibility that could not be ignored. The sky had been conquered, but peace would demand restraint. In hindsight, the appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo can be seen as more than a military milestone. It was a turning point in human history, marking the moment when distance ceased to be a reliable defense. From that point forward, no nation could assume safety based solely on geography. Air power, and later missiles and satellites, would compress the world into a single shared vulnerability. The pilots who flew those missions aged quietly. Some spoke often of the war, others rarely did. Their memories were filled not with triumph, but with long flights over endless water, the hum of engines, the glow of instruments, and the knowledge that entire cities lay beneath their wings. For them, victory was not abstract. It was personal, measured in friends who did not return. Japanese pilots carried their own memories, of climbing into unreliable machines, of fuel gauges sinking faster than expected, of enemies appearing where none should have been. Many survived to witness Japan's rebirth, living long enough to see the nation they defended transform into something entirely different. One image lingers above all others. A single Mustang, silver against the pale sky, cruising over Tokyo without opposition. No tracer fire. No interception. Just presence. A quiet declaration that the age of isolation had ended. That image is not about domination. It is about inevitability. The war in the Pacific was decided by many factors: strategy, sacrifice, chance. But the moment the Mustangs reached Tokyo, the balance of power became undeniable. The sky, once contested, had been claimed. The future, once uncertain, had chosen its direction. In the decades that followed, nations around the world studied that lesson. Aircraft grew faster, longer-ranged, more complex. Warfare extended into space and cyberspace. Yet the underlying truth remained unchanged. Power belongs to those who can sustain it, integrate it, and adapt it faster than their adversaries. The P-51 Mustang was not merely an aircraft of its time. It was a signal of what was to come. A reminder that modern civilization rewards preparation over passion, coordination over chaos, and systems over symbols. When American P-51 Mustangs shocked Japan over Tokyo, they did more than escort bombers or win battles. They ended an era defined by distance and belief, and ushered in one defined by reach and reality. The sky never returned to what it had been before. And in that transformation, humanity learned a lesson it continues to relearn in every generation. The future does not belong to those who believe it cannot be reached, but to those who build the means to arrive there first.